There are a few phrases in American Christianity that we tend to pull out of our back pockets whenever there's some type of emotional emergency. These little phrases that are supposed to just make us feel a little bit better. And what I have found is a lot of these little Christianese phrases aren't even biblical. Not only are they not biblical, they seem to be theologically whack. Am I too old to say whack? Too young to say whack? I don't know. Anyway, but we just pull these phrases out and we use them anytime we need a little something to say. Let me give you some examples of some verses that aren't actually verses, things that we say that aren't actually from the Bible. Maybe you've heard this. Cleanliness is next to godliness. Anybody know where that is in Scripture? Yeah, 1 Dusty 7:2 or something like that. Let me give you another one. Hold on, I had another one I thought was really good. God helps those who help themselves. Yeah, it doesn't seem to be in there because I Googled it. Maybe of all the little Christianese phrases that we pull out, I want to talk about one today that has become so much a part of our culture that we just assume it's biblical. We assume it's theological. You've all heard this before. God will not give you more than you can handle. This is so ingrained in our culture that I went online and I Googled just the first little part of this to see how it would autofill. You want to see what it came up with? I gave them an image, if you can pop that up there real quick. This is it. All I put is, God will not give, and the very first thing says, where can you find the verse in the Bible that says, God will not give you more than you can handle? Like, it's so ingrained in our culture, we just assume that it's in there somewhere. It's not only not in there, but theologically, it's a wreck. When we take this at face value, that God will not give me more than I can handle, what we're saying theologically is, God is on one side of the net, and He is serving up problems into our side of the court. And then we, in turn, have to deal with these problems on our own. In other words, God is consistently trying to see how much we can handle, and He just keeps lobbing tennis balls over, and we're just trying to handle them the best that we can on our own. This is so false theologically, but it's so easy just to pull it out of your back pocket. You know, when my wife came to me a few years back and said, we're pregnant with kid number 4. Whoa, God won't give us more than we can handle, right? Like, we got that little, this helps us in our emotional emergency. Or Josh is headed up the mountain with about 30 teenagers to go camping for the teen encounter this year, right? Josh, God won't give you more than you can handle. Like, this is our trick. All right, take this with you. This will help you. For some of us, though, maybe you're going through some things that are sincerely troubling and challenging. Maybe there's a health scare. You're waiting to hear back from a doctor. A lot of us have been in this situation. And maybe somebody has said, hey, man, God won't give you more than you can handle, which again is just saying that you're on your own, but God won't give you too much. Maybe there's some of us in here that financially we're struggling. We're just exhausted financially. And now your car is making a funny noise, right? Or one of the kids ends up in the emergency room. And again, we pull this emergency little phrase out, God won't give you more than you can handle. You're on your own. Let me step out of this sermon just for a second and we're going to take a little side trail. The closest verse that we have to this comes in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, where it says, God is faithful. He will not tempt you beyond what you can bear. He will always provide a way out, or depending on your translation, a way out from underneath it. And that verse, although it sounds a little similar, is a totally different concept. What it's saying is there is no excuse for our sin. God will not force you to sin. He will never tempt you at such a level that you don't have a way to make a righteous choice. It has nothing to do with what we're talking about today, but that's probably the closest verse. So if you're sitting there going, oh, there's this one verse, this is Paul talking, it's totally unrelated to this concept. All right. God will not give you more than you can handle. What I have found in my journey is that oftentimes God does give me a whole lot more than I can handle, but He will walk through it with me. He is right there next to me the entire time. I want to look at a story that we've all heard before, but as I begin to study this, it really opened my eyes to some of these challenges that we're going to talk about today. And this is the story of Gideon. I have probably learned about Gideon growing up. Maybe you have too. Maybe you're here today and you don't even know who Gideon is, besides his name is on the little Bibles that get passed around. It's an inside Christian joke, never mind. But I want to look at this story of Gideon with some fresh eyes this morning. This is Judges chapter 6. And just listen what's going on here. Again, it starts out, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And for 7 years, He gave them into the hands of the Midianites. Understand, this culture in this day, it was really commonplace for a group to rise up and take over a chunk of land. And this had happened. The Midianites had overtaken the Israelites because God allowed this to happen. Verse 2. Because of the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. Don't gloss over that little verse right there. They have been driven out of their homes, and now they're literally living in the mountains, in caves. They're just trying to find some sort of shelter. I don't know what it is that God has given you more than you can handle, but I doubt that you spent 7 years living in a cave. If you have, come talk to me. It would make an amazing testimony. So they have no place to go because the Midianites are so strong. They have taken over their land. They have no place to live. Verse 3. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, their growing food, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep nor cattle nor donkey. Here's what he's saying. Not only are you homeless, you can't even grow any food. You don't even have any livestock left. Now, there's a few things that are still kind of floating around, but for the most part, the Midianites have conquered everything. Now, is this more than they can handle? I would argue this is an incredible challenge that these guys are facing. Verse 5, again talking about the Midianites, they came up with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count them or their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. You've lost everything. God has given them way more than they can handle. Now, don't get me wrong, it's their fault because they've been worshiping Baal. We're going to learn about that here in a second. So they've been doing something they weren't supposed to do. But now God has taken away their shelter, He has taken away their food, and they seem to have nothing left. If there is a great setup for an amazing story in Scripture, this is it. Everything has been taken. What are we going to do now? Verse 6. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they finally, I added that word, they finally cried out to the Lord for help. All right, God, I know we've been worshiping this other god, Baal, but we don't have a place to live. We have no food to eat. Please, will you come and help us? Verse 7, I'm going to read this really fast, but just hang out with me here. When the Israelites cried out to the Lord because of Midian, he sent them a prophet who said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. I snatched you from the power of Egypt and from the hand of all your oppressors. I drove them from before you and gave you their land. I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live. But you have not listened to me." Basically, God is saying, yeah, I hear you. I'm not deaf to what you're saying, but these are the corrective consequences of your sin, of what you've done. And in verse 11, finally, we get to meet this amazing character. Here comes the introduction of Gideon. The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak of Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abizrite, where his son Gideon, listen, oh my word, this is an incredible introduction to a character. Listen to what Gideon's doing. Where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. This character, Gideon, who's going to become our protagonist in this story, he's the big hero, right? Listen, this is how he is found. He's taken some wheat and he's threshing it, which literally means taking the part that's edible and detaching it from the plant. But now he's hiding in the winepress. Why is he hiding? Because every time they get food, the Midianites come and take it from them. So here he is, hiding in a winepress, trying to get just a little bit of food that he might cook and eat. So listen what the angel says here. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you." What's it say? Mighty warrior. Does anybody else find that hilarious? This is like the classic movie bit whenever somebody goes, I need you, or you're the one we've chosen, and you just see Gideon like in the corner, like trying to just get a little bit of food, and he's like, are you mighty warrior? I mean, this is so far outlandish that this is crazy talk. He goes, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Here we go. Oh, love this passage. "But, sir," or "pardon me, my Lord," Gideon replied. Again, you see this. Later on, you're going to understand that he is the smallest of the weakest clan. He's not a mighty warrior at all, not in his eyes. "Pardon me," Gideon replied, "but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us?" Sit in this for a second. Whatever challenge you're facing, whatever it is, as we did this intro about God won't give you more than you can handle, there's a something that comes to your mind, right? A challenge that you're facing. And do we not all at some point say, well, if God is with me, then why are all these bad things happening? I find this interesting because this is something we in American culture we talk about, but they dealt with the same thing thousands of years ago. The lie is, if God is with me, everything is going to be perfect. If God is with me, the blessings are going to be unstoppable. What I'm seeing in this passage, and I believe it to be true today, is sometimes God absolutely gives us more than we can handle. He absolutely puts the pressure on us once in a while just to see how we will react, whether or not we will lean in to Him. And so Gideon says the exact same thing I would have said and you would have said. Are you sure you got the right guy? Because, listen, if God is with us, none of these bad things would have happened. Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hands of Midian. As if God didn't already know this. He's like, man, if God is with us, why are all these crazy bad things happening? Why are we losing the battle? Verse 14. The Lord turned to him and said, go in the strength you have and save Israelite out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? This is key right here. He's saying, don't you get this? I am sending you. Aren't I sending you? Do you recognize that you're the mighty warrior here? You're the one that I am sending? In verse 15, again, I'm Gideon. I don't know if you feel this, but I just feel like Gideon. He goes, well, pardon me, Lord. It's like, I've got some more questions here that we need to address. How is it that I can save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family. I am nothing. There is no way that I can overtake all of the Midianites. I mean, they've literally come in and taken our homes. They're camping on our crops, and somehow I'm supposed to deal with this while I'm hiding in a wine press trying to peel a banana and eat a little bit of food, right? This is so crazy. Verse 16. The Lord answered, I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive. If you want to talk about a passage of Scripture where God has given somebody more than they can handle, this is it. This is the premier example. Gideon, the smallest, the weakest, hiding in a corner, and he's called mighty warrior, and God says to him, the Lord says to him, listen, you are going to be the one that's going to conquer Midian. Verse 17, Gideon replied, if now I have found favor in your eyes, give me a sign. As if the Lord, this angel showing up, isn't enough of a sign. I believe this may be true in some of our journeys too. When we're going through a really challenging time, we're like, all right, God, we're crying out to God just like the Israelites did, just like I believe Gideon did. I believe he was part of the Israelites crying out, God, why are we here? Why are we being oppressed? Are we not your kids, right? And so we're in that spot and we're seeking God, and then God gives us like a clear directive and maybe even a sign, and our first reaction is, well, God, first of all, are you sure you got the right guy? And then maybe I could get a second sign. Like maybe you could do something else just to make sure. And I love this passage because you see some grace in the Lord right here. It says, Gideon says in 18, says, please do not go away until I come back and bring my offering and set it before you. And the Lord said, I will wait until you return. Interesting that the Lord is waiting on Gideon. Verse 19. Gideon went inside, prepared a young goat from an ephah of flour. He made bread without yeast, putting the meat in the basket and its broth in a pot. He brought them out and offered them to him under the oak. The angel of the Lord said to him, take the meat and the unleavened bread, place them on this rock, and pour out the broth. And Gideon did so. Then the angel of the Lord touched the meat and the unleavened bread with the tip of the staff that was in his hand. Fire flared from the rock, consuming the meat and the bread, and the angel of the Lord disappeared. Sign accepted, right? Now it's been proven, right? If that's not enough for you, I don't know what's going to be enough for you. We have proven that this is from the Lord. Verse 22, when Gideon realized that it was the angel of the Lord, he exclaimed, alas, sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. But the Lord said to him, peace, do not be afraid. You are not going to die. A couple more quick verses here, and then we're going to sit on something one more time. Verse 24, so Gideon built an altar to the Lord there and called it the Lord is Peace. To this day it stands in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. That same night, here we go, listen. That same night, the Lord said to him, this is his directive. here we go. We've got the call, right? We've confirmed it's from God. Now we're turning a corner. We're actually going to have to do what God has called us to do. So here's his first to do, his first action he is supposed to take. Take the second bull from your father's herd, the one 7 years old. Tear down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Then build a proper kind of altar to the Lord, your God, on top of this height. Using the wood of the Asherah pole that you cut down, offer a second bull as a burnt offering. Now, hold on. You need to understand a little bit about an altar to Baal. There are different sized altars. Some would be huge, some would be small. There's no specific size that is required. An Asherah pole is typically a tree and that was planted. It was a permanent structure. Not always, but usually this Asherah pole is a tree that's built. These are for two different gods that the Israelites were worshiping, even though they were supposed to worship the one true God. Maybe the most important part, though, is they were always put in high places. And if you go back to verse 25, it tells us that. It tells us that this was in a high place. And I'll give you a little hint on something that's coming later. It is in a place where everybody in town can see it. So this is not the middle of town, but it's up on a hillside, not a mountaintop, but it's up on a hillside where everybody can visually see these two altars. So they had to be big enough that from a distance, I can recognize that overlooking my town is Baal in this Asherah pole. You got it? And God calls his mighty warrior to go tear down that altar in front of not only his own people, but all these other people who have camped there. No wonder he starts by calling him mighty warrior. This is a monumental task. This is way bigger than probably any of us in this room will ever have to deal with. And he's supposed to go tear it down, and he's going to cut down this Asherah pole, and he's going to chop up the wood, and he's going to build an altar to God, and he's going to sacrifice a bull in this high place over this city so everybody knows who the true God is. This is what God has asked him to do. And then verse 27, here it comes. You ready? So Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord told him, but because he was afraid of his family and the townspeople, he did it at night rather than in the daytime. That one little verse, I wish it would come alive to each of us in this room. Imagine Gideon, he's got this call from God, crystal clear, mighty warrior, we're tearing down these altars. Go do this, Gideon. Go be bold and strong and courageous. And Gideon gets 10 servants, and in the middle of the night, so nobody will see him, he sneaks up there and somehow tears down a large tree and an altar to Baal without waking up anybody. This to me does not look at all like a mighty warrior, right? This is where God has told him exactly what he's supposed to do, and he did it technically, but not really with the boldness that God has asked him to do it. A lot of us are guilty of this. When God has asked us to do something and it's challenging and we know it's big, maybe it's something for our kids or it's to heal a relationship, or I don't know what it is that God has put on your heart, and what we do is we say, yes, God, we've crossed this line of faith, we're going to do it, and then we just kind of sort of mention it, kind of get through it a little bit. 2 weeks back, we, in our series Out of Context, we looked at a passage that said where 2 or more are gathered together, God is with them. And what we learned about that passage is ultimately it's about reconciliation when there's sin between 2 people, and that we should biblically go to the person who has offended us or who is living in sin, and we should have a real heart-to-heart with them about this. And God will absolutely be with us when we go. This is what we learned. And at the end of that passage, I said this, or at the end of that sermon, I said, how many of us in here would be honest and say, God has been speaking to me during this sermon about somebody that I need to go sit down and meet with? And we had a ton of hands. I wouldn't say most of us, but I'd say a lot of hands when I said, hey, I'm supposed to go have a conversation with somebody. But how many of us got the clear call? Sitting here, God put him on your heart, him or her, whoever it was, your kids, your parents, whatever. And you're supposed to go have this real heart-to-heart, and you meant to do it, and you meant to be a mighty warrior, and you meant to go sit down and have this great conversation, and instead, hey, just don't know if you noticed or not, but the other day, again, not trying to be offensive, but I just wanted to let you know, and please don't hate me when I tell you this, but hey, I just want, and you did this one thing, and I think some people might have been offended, sinned, right? This is Gideon. I am Gideon. You are Gideon. He's got this clear call from God. Be bold and courageous. I'm calling you to be a mighty warrior. Gideon does not know his future, but God does, and he's going to do great things in the next chapter. It's coming. And this is almost like this first little test to see how he does. Here's his first to-do list, the first box that he is going to check. I want you to go tear down this altar. I want you to worship me on top of this mountain. And Gideon in verse 27 sneaks up there in the middle of the night, does it successfully without waking up anybody. Verse 28. In the morning, when the men of the town got up, there was Baal's altar, demolished, with the Asherah pole beside it cut down, and the second bull sacrificed on the newly built altar. And they ask each other, who did this? Well, what happened? They all would have seen it. I mean, this towers over the city. You could see it from almost anywhere. So they all realized it's been torn down. Who did this? When they carefully investigated, they were told, Gideon, son of Joash, did it. This is another verse. I know this is just dreaming. This is extra biblical, what I'm about to tell you. But I hope when I get to heaven, they'll fill in some of these gaps. Like, I want to talk with some of these people and ask them what happened. I want to know what the investigation looked like. Like, is it like a CSI episode, where they're going to interview different people? Did you hear anything last night, or did you see anything? Well, Gideon and like 10 guys were sneaking around behind the bushes. I don't know what they were like. What happened? Why did this happen? Verse 30. The men of the town demanded of Joash, bring out your son, he must die because he has broken down Baal's altar and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. But Joash replied to the hostile crowd, this is Gideon's dad, replied to the hostile crowd around him, are you going to plead Baal's cause? Are you fighting for Baal? He doesn't need your help, he's saying. Are you trying to save him? Whoever fights for him shall be put to death by morning. If Baal really is a god, he can defend himself when someone breaks down his altar. So that day, they called Gideon Jerubbaal, meaning, saying, let Baal contend with him because he broke down Baal's altar. Jerubbaal really just means let Baal deal with him. But they changed his name publicly right here. His name's been changed. Now all the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern people joined forces and crossed over the Jordan and camped in the valley of Jezreel. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, summoning the Abiezrites to follow him. He sent messengers throughout Manasseh, calling them to arms, and also into Asher, Zabulon, and Naphtali, so that they too went up to meet them. All right, we're going to stop right there. Next week, we're going to get into some more of Gideon. It's a two-parter. I want you to get a couple of things here at the very end of our reading today. One is, God knew ahead of time what was coming. He knew that all these tribes even more tribes are moving in on the land. And so ahead of time, he has given Gideon more than he can handle to tear down this altar, his first big chore. This is what God is. And it seemed ridiculous to Gideon, the smallest of the weakest, but God was prepping him. God was training him, teaching him, like, if you stick with me, we can do this. I believe sometimes when God gives us more than we can handle, it's absolutely purposeful. And he may be prepping you for something really challenging. And we have to accept that. We have to go, all right, God, I'm here, I'm listening, I'm on your team, I understand how you see me. God, give me the courage and the strength to be bold. I wrote down, if you're in this situation, maybe not as severe as Gideon, but if you're in a place where you're going, you know what, Dusty, there's something going on in my spiritual journey right now that is so big, I just don't know if I can handle it. I have 5 really quick questions. I'll just roll through these really quickly. 5 quick questions I think are great to talk to God about. So we've defined the problem. For Gideon, it was their land's been taken over by the Midianites. For you, it could be financial or relational or spiritual or whatever. So you got something that you're dealing with. And so as you sit down and process this with God, I've got 5 quick questions I think will help. Number 1, is God calling me? And this, is God calling me to fix this problem? Now, this seems really kind of pedestrian or like an elementary style question, but I think this is critical. This is really important that you cross this line. It may be really fast, like you may sit down to pray and God's already told you, hey, I want you to do this. But if you're wrestling with whether or not you're supposed to fix it, whether or not you're supposed to jump in and save the day, you have to ask this question, is God calling me? The reason it's important is because if you get a yes to this question, it gives you more courage and strength because you know God is with you. If you ask this question, God, are you calling me to do this? And God says, no, maybe you still want to do it, but this is a totally different journey. My first question on anything that's a big challenge, a big gauntlet that I got to go through is, God, am I the one that's supposed to do this? Understand in Gideon's story, everybody was complaining. Everybody was asking for a solution. And God said no to everybody but Gideon. Gideon is the one, he said, I have this for you. So once you've got to sit in this. God, am I the one that's supposed to be doing this? If he says yes, prepare yourself. It may not be easy, but God will go with you. Number 2, what are God's goals and what are my goals? If I were to take percentages on how many of us think we know better than God, it would hover right around 100%. Right? Most of us think that we know what needs to happen. Do you think Gideon knew what needed to happen? Absolutely. He knew exactly what he wanted to do. He wanted lightning to come down out of heaven to just electrocute all the bad guys and for them to go back the way things used to be. He knew what he wanted for sure. So what are God's goals and what are my goals? And when I'm dealing with this, I am processing with the Spirit. I am sitting down and there's quiet time, and maybe you even pull out a sheet of paper and make a list. God's goals, my goals. And listen, just because you have goals doesn't make those things bad. That's fine. You may have some things that you're trying to accomplish that God will give you permission to conquer. That's fine. But we have to sit in that moment and wrestle with these things. What does God want me to do in this ridiculous situation? And then do I have any goals? Number 3. What are the consequences of disobedience? What happens if I decide not to listen to God? What happens if I decide not to go have that awkward conversation? What happens if I decide not to write that check and help my neighbor? What happens if I stop doing what God has called me to do? Whatever it is, what are the consequences of my disobedience? And sometimes just sitting in that allows us to understand the importance of what God has called us to do. Number 4, what does success look like? What does it look like to fully accomplish this thing? Not skirt around it, not sneak up, not send a short little text, but what does actual success, I've conquered it, what does this look like? And sometimes this visual, or even this mental game of seeing what happens if we are disobedient, what are the consequences of disobedience, and comparing that to the consequences of success, of following and doing exactly what God has called us to do. Whenever we see those two things, I think it can help us become the mighty warrior that God wants us all to be. And then number 5, am I being bold? Do I believe that God is with me? Do I see myself as a mighty warrior? Church, this is my prayer for us. I believe most of us in here have something that God is leading us to do. It may be as simple as, hey man, I want you to start reading your Bible every day. I want you to begin to grow in your relationship with me. I think that's a given for all of us, but maybe you just haven't been doing that. And God is saying, hey, this is the next step for us. This is the next step for you and me to get connected on a daily basis. Maybe it's that. But then for a few of us in here, there's like this big chunk that God is going to give you way more than you can handle. And a relationship that has been broken for a year, 2 years, a decade, God is going to say, I want you to go have an absolute, real conversation with this person. And this is the best part. If he calls you to do it, he will be with you. And no matter how you see yourself, God sees you as a mighty warrior. And God believes that you can conquer it, or he would not have called you to do it. All right. I invite you to come back next week. We're going to look at the next chapter of this and finish this story of Gideon and what God does through this mighty warrior.